The letter arrived on a Tuesday, March 14th, 2017. I remember because Tuesdays were the days I drove my truck into Garfield to pick up dog food and whatever else the list said, and the list that week said nothing at all because I hadn't written one. I'd stopped writing lists sometime around November. November was when the last check from the VA disability adjustment came through at $612, and I sat at the kitchen table and divided it by the bills on the counter and understood that the math didn't work anymore and probably wasn't going to. My name is Earl Jessup. I'm 74 years old. I lived at the time, in a rented single-wide on Taggart Road about 9 miles south of Garfield in Mineral County, West Virginia. The trailer belonged to a man named Denny Skaggs, who charged me $400 a month and hadn't raised it in 6 years, which was the only piece of financial luck I'd had since my wife, Miriam, passed in 2012. Before the trailer, I had a house. Before the house, I had a career. Before the career, I had a war. And before the war, I had a mother who told me the world would give me exactly what I earned, which turned out to be half true and half something else entirely. The dog's name was Kip. He was a 12-year-old blue-tick coonhound with a torn ear and a right rear leg that didn't bend all the way, and he was the only living creature on Earth who needed me for anything. I found him behind the Dollar General in Kaiser in 2009. Ribs showing, no collar, standing in the rain like he'd been stood up for a date. Miriam said we couldn't afford a dog. I said we couldn't afford not to have one. She understood what I meant. She always understood what I meant, even when I didn't say it right. So it was a Tuesday, and I pulled into the gravel lot at the Garfield post office, and Kip stayed in the bed of the truck, a 1991 Chevrolet S10 with 263,000 miles and a passenger door that only opened from the outside. And I walked in, and Brenda Koger behind the counter handed me one piece of mail. Not a bill, not an ad, a letter, cream-colored envelope, heavy paper, the kind you buy on purpose. My name and address handwritten in blue ink, and in the upper left corner, a return address in Bethesda, Maryland, and a name I hadn't seen in 31 years, Frank Del Vecchio. Sergeant First Class Frank Del Vecchio, if we're being proper about it. Though by 2017 he'd been retired from the Army longer than he'd served in it. We'd been stationed together at Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, then again at Fort Bragg, then one more time at a forward operating base in Grenada in 1983 that nobody talks about and most people have forgotten. Frank was the kind of man who remembered everything. Birthdays, blood types, who owed him $11 from a poker game in 1986. I hadn't spoken to him since Miriam's funeral, when he'd driven 7 hours from Maryland, stood in the rain at the cemetery, squeezed my shoulder once, and driven back without eating. I sat in the truck with the engine off. Kip put his chin on the edge of the bed and watched me through the rear window. I opened the envelope with my pocket knife, a buck 110 that had belonged to my father, and I unfolded the letter and read it twice. Frank's handwriting hadn't changed in 40 years. Small, precise, all capitals, like he was still filling out after-action reports. The letter was dated November 9th, 2019, 11 days before it reached me. He wrote that he was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in August. He said it plainly, the way Frank said everything. No self-pity, no philosophy. Just the fact, then the next sentence. The next sentence was about a house, He wrote that his mother's older sister, a woman named Estelle Greer, had died in 2014 at 91 years old in a nursing home in Weaverville, North Carolina. She'd owned a small house on a ridge above the French Broad River, just south of the Buncombe County line. The house had been built in 1927 by her husband, a man named Rudolph Greer, who'd worked timber for Champion Fiber and died in 1963 of a stroke. Estelle had lived there alone after that for 51 years. When she passed, the property went into a kind of legal limbo. No will, no children, a nephew in Delaware who didn't want it, a county that couldn't sell it because the deed had a surveying error from 1948. Frank had spent 3 years working with a title attorney in Asheville to straighten it out. He'd paid the back taxes himself, $4,600. He'd driven down twice to walk the property. Then he wrote the part that made me read the letter a second time. He said he was giving me the house. Not selling, giving. The paperwork was already filed. A quitclaim deed, notarized in Hagerstown, Maryland, transferring the property to me. He said the house was rough. He said the road was bad. He said there was probably water damage and maybe worse. But he said the land was 3.5 acres with a creek, a stone foundation, and a view that Estelle had once described as the reason God made mountains in the first place. At the bottom of the letter, below his signature, he'd written one more line. It said, "You told me once you wanted to die somewhere quiet. This is the quietest place I know." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and sat there for a long time. Kip whined once from the bed of the truck. A woman came out of the post office carrying a package and glanced at me and looked away. The sky was flat and white. I could smell the paper mill from across the river. That sulfur smell that clings to everything in Chillicothe like a second atmosphere. I didn't call Frank. I should have. I picked up the phone twice that evening and put it down both times. I told myself I'd call in the morning, after I'd thought about what to say. But the truth is, I didn't know what to say to a dying man who just handed me the only gift anyone had given me in 6 years. Thank you felt small. I'm sorry felt useless. So I said nothing. And 3 weeks later, his daughter called to tell me he was gone. He died on December 1st, a Sunday, at Johns Hopkins, with his daughter and his ex-wife beside him. He was 74. I drove to Hagerstown for the service. Kip stayed with my neighbor. There were 11 people in the church, and I was the only one wearing a regimental tie. After, his daughter, a tall woman named Christine, who looked exactly like Frank around the eyes, handed me a manila envelope. Inside was the quitclaim deed, a hand-drawn map, and a single key on a piece of butcher's twine. She said, "He talked about you more than he talked about anyone." I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat and didn't open it again for 2 months. It sat on my kitchen counter through all of December and most of January. The manila envelope, I mean, right next to the toaster, where I'd set the mail I didn't want to deal with, the VA pharmacy notices, the power bill, the coupon circulars addressed to Margaret. I'd look at it every morning while the coffee brewed and Kip sat by his bowl waiting for breakfast. And I'd think, tomorrow. Tomorrow I'll figure out what to do with a house I've never seen in a place I've never been. What finally moved me was the weather. February 2nd, 2019. Groundhog Day, if you care about that sort of thing. And Morgantown woke up under 9 inches of wet snow. My truck wouldn't start. The block heater had failed sometime in the night, and I stood in the driveway at 6:15 in the morning, turning the key to nothing but clicking. Kip watched me from the front window. I could see his breath fogging the glass. I came back inside, sat down at the kitchen table with coffee I'd reheated in the microwave, and I picked up the envelope because it was the only thing within reach that wasn't a bill or a memory. Frank's map was drawn on the back of a Denny's placemat. I'm not exaggerating, the paper kind. With the kid's words search on one side, he'd used a blue ballpoint to sketch Route 28 heading south out of Elkins. Then a county road marked Alpena Gap Road. Then a dotted line going east with the note, past the white church, 2.7 miles. Gravel. At the end of the dotted line, he'd drawn a small rectangle and written house in block letters, and below it, underlined twice, creek behind. That was it. No address, no parcel number, just a dead man's handwriting on a Denny's placemat. The quitclaim deed was more formal, but not by much. It listed the property as 4.6 acres in Randolph County, West Virginia, described by metes and bounds I couldn't begin to follow. Thence along the ridge north, 42 degrees east, 210 feet, to an iron pin, and transferred ownership from Franklin David Purcell to Walter James Coyne for consideration of $1. Frank had signed it in blue ink. The notary stamp was from a UPS store in Frederick. I called Christine that evening. She picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear a child in the background. I told her I was thinking about driving down to see the property, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Coyne, I'm going to be honest with you. I drove out there once, maybe 2014. The road's rough. The house is, well, it's standing. That's about all I can promise." She paused. Dad always said it was worth more than it looked. I never understood what he meant by that. I thanked her and hung up. Kip was lying on the kitchen floor with his chin on my boot, which was his way of saying he'd heard enough talking and would prefer dinner. I fed him, then stood at the window watching the snow come down on Grafton Road. And I thought about what Frank had said that day in Frederick, sitting across from me with his hands wrapped around a mug. He'd said, "The house isn't much, Walt, but what's under it? That's something else." I'd asked him what he meant. He'd smiled in that way he had, where only the left side of his mouth moved, and said, "You'll know when you see it." The snow melted by Valentine's Day. On February 16th, a Saturday, I loaded Kip into the truck, put Frank's placemat map on the dashboard, and headed south on Route 119 toward Elkins. The drive was 2 hours and 40 minutes. The roads were clear until I hit the turnoff past Huttonsville. Then it was gravel, then dirt, then something that wasn't really a road at all. Just two ruts with frozen mud between them and laurel branches scraping both sides of the truck. Kip stood on the bench seat with his nose pressed to the windshield, tail going. The Ford bounced hard enough that the placemat slid off the dashboard twice. Frank's handwriting was small and precise, the way it had always been on field reports, and he'd drawn a little X where the house sat, about 9 miles up from the county road. Elevation, 3,200 feet. I could feel the altitude in my ears by the time I found it. The driveway, if you could call it that, curved through a stand of red spruce and opened into a clearing maybe half an acre wide. And there it was. I shut off the engine and sat there. The house was small, maybe 700 square feet, single story, built from rough-cut oak that had gone silver with weather. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had rotted through. Two windows faced me, both intact but so filmed with grime they looked like cataracts. The roof was green metal, streaked with rust, and a section near the chimney had buckled upward where ice had gotten underneath. There was a woodshed to the right, half collapsed, and behind it I could see the remains of what might have been an outhouse. Thistle and blackberry had taken the yard. A rusted propane tank sat tilted against the east wall like a drunk leaning on a friend. I looked at Kip. Kip looked at the house. His tail was still going. "That's it," I said. "That's what Frank left us." I got out. The air was sharp and clean and smelled like spruce resin and cold stone. No sound except wind in the canopy and a creak somewhere below. I walked to the porch and tested the first step with my boot. It held, but the second one cracked, and I had to step wide. The front door was locked with a padlock, a master brand, old but solid, and the key Frank's lawyer had mailed me fitted on the first try. The hasp pulled free with a sound like a small bone breaking. I pushed the door open. Cold air came out, carrying dust and mouse droppings and something deeper, like wet stone. The inside was exactly what you'd expect. A single room with a potbelly stove, a cot frame with no mattress, a wooden table, two chairs, a set of shelves holding mason jars with things inside them I chose not to examine. Newspaper had been stuffed into the wall gaps for insulation. I could read a headline from the Elkins Intermountain dated November 1987. A calendar on the wall showed April 1991 with a photograph of a whitetail buck. I stood there and I thought, "Frank, what were you thinking? This wasn't a house. This was a hunting cabin that someone had pretended was a house for long enough that the county assessor went along with it. No running water, no electric, no insulation worth the name. The wood stove pipe was so corroded I wouldn't trust it to vent a candle." I turned to leave, but Kip had pushed past my legs and was standing in the center of the room with his head low, ears forward, tail rigid, not wagging anymore, pointing, the way he used to point at the back fence when a groundhog was underneath. He was staring at the floor. I said, "Kip, come on." But he didn't move, not an inch. Just stood there with his nose aimed at a spot between the stove and the south wall, where the floorboards ran in a slightly different direction than the rest. I noticed it then. 3 planks laid east-west when everything else ran north-south. Whoever did it hadn't even tried to match the wood. The rest of the floor was old-growth oak, dark with age. These 3 boards were pine, lighter, maybe 20 years newer. I knelt down. My knees complained the way they always do now. That grinding sound Helen used to say reminded her of a pepper mill. I ran my fingers along the seam. The boards weren't nailed. They were screwed, Phillips head, countersunk just enough to sit flush. Somebody had wanted these boards to come up again. I didn't have a screwdriver. I had my truck key and a pocket knife. I used the knife blade, a Case Stockman I've carried since 1984, and it fit the screws well enough. They turned easy. Too easy. Someone had greased the threads. I pulled the first board and the smell hit me. Not rot, not mildew. Cool mineral air, like the inside of a well. Kip's tail finally moved, one slow wag the way he does when he's confirmed something he already knew. Under the 3 boards was a cavity about 4 feet by 3 feet, maybe 2 feet deep. It had been lined with poured concrete, Rough work, but solid. No cracks, no water seepage. Somebody had done this with care, and sitting inside, dead center, was a metal box. Not a lockbox, not a safe. A military ammunition can. The old .50 caliber size, OD green, with the latch still intact. I recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. I'd carried thousands of those cans. This one had no markings except a strip of white medical tape across the lid with 3 letters in black ink. RCH. I lifted it out. Heavy. Maybe 30 pounds. The latch was stiff, but it opened without a key. I set it on the floor, and Kip came and sat beside me, pressing his shoulder against my hip the way he does when he thinks I need steadying. Inside, on top, was a sealed plastic bag containing papers. Beneath the bag, wrapped in oilcloth, were 8 gold bars, small ones, each about the size of a deck of cards, maybe a little thicker. They were stamped, but not in English. The script looked like it could be Vietnamese or maybe Lao, I wasn't sure. Each bar had a number pressed into the bottom edge. I picked one up, and my wrist remembered the density immediately. You don't forget what gold feels like once you've held it. This was real. I set the bar back down and opened the plastic bag. There were 3 items inside. A faded Polaroid of 2 men standing in front of a helicopter. A Huey, door gunner's position visible behind them. One of the men was Frank Hambly, 40 years younger, shirtless, dog tags hanging. The other man I didn't recognize. On the back of the Polaroid, in Frank's handwriting, it said, "Me and Duke, Quang Tri, March 71. The second item was a hand-drawn map on graph paper, folded into quarters, showing a river, a ridge, and a small X with the word cash written beside it. The third item was a letter, 2 pages, addressed to me. It began, "Walt, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to ask you to do." I sat on that cold cellar floor and read the letter twice. Then I read it a third time because my hands were shaking and I'd skipped a line somewhere in the middle. Frank wrote the way he talked. Plain, no decoration, like a man who'd learned that extra words get people killed. The letter explained that the gold had come from Vietnam. Not stolen, not looted, recovered. In March of 1971, Frank's recon team had been inserted by helicopter into Quang Tri province to locate a North Vietnamese supply cache reported by Signals Intelligence. What they found wasn't weapons, it was gold. Approximately 40 bars, each weighing 1 kilogram, packed in wooden ammunition crates and buried under a collapsed French colonial outpost that the NVA had been using as a waypoint along the trail. Frank's team leader, a staff sergeant named Rollins, radioed in the find. Command told them to secure the site and wait for extraction. Extraction never came. Instead, they got hit that night by a company-sized NVA element. 2 men died. Rollins lost his left arm below the elbow. Frank carried the radio operator, a 20-year-old kid from Detroit, 400 meters through elephant grass to the extraction point, with rounds snapping past his ears. By the time the Huey pulled them out, the cache site was overrun and nobody at battalion wanted to talk about gold that officially didn't exist. But Frank went back. Not during the war. Years later. He didn't say how, and I didn't need him to. The man I'd known was resourceful in the way that only comes from growing up poor and surviving combat. The letter said he'd recovered 12 bars over 2 trips in the late 1980s, working with the man in the Polaroid. Duke. a former South Vietnamese army translator who'd escaped to Thailand in '79 and eventually made it to California. Duke had died in 2004. Frank wrote that sentence without commentary, just the name and the year, the way veterans mark their dead. The gold had been sitting in this cellar since 1991. 33 years? Frank had never sold a single bar. The letter explained why in one sentence that I've never forgotten. I couldn't figure out who it belonged to, so I left it alone. That was Frank. He'd risked his life twice to recover something, and then spent 3 decades unable to use it, because the moral question wouldn't resolve. What he was asking me to do was settle that question. The letter laid it out. He wanted me to find Duke's daughter, a woman named Lynn Nguyen, last known address in San Jose, California. He wanted half the gold to go to her. The other half, Frank wrote, was mine, on the condition that I personally delivered Lynn's share and told her what her father had done, because Duke had never told his family. She should know he was brave, Frank wrote. Her old man crawled through the same mud I did and never got a parade. I folded the letter and put it back in the bag. Bo was sitting at the top of the cellar stairs, watching me with that patient look dogs give you when they've already figured out what you haven't. 12 bars of gold. I didn't know the exact market price, but I knew enough. A kilogram bar in 2024 was worth somewhere around $75,000. 12 bars meant roughly $900,000. Half for me, half for a woman I'd never met, living somewhere in California, who didn't know her father had once crawled through a jungle with a man from North Carolina to dig up gold that no government would acknowledge existed. I looked at Bo. "Well," I said, "I guess we're going to California." He wagged his tail once, like he'd known all along. I climbed out of the cellar, pulled the hatch mostly closed, and walked back through the house into the late afternoon light. The mountains were turning purple at their edges, the way they do in the Appalachians when the sun drops behind the ridgeline. I sat on that rotten porch step and called the only person I could think to call, a man named Ray Salcedo, who'd served with me in the 25th Infantry and who'd spent the last 20 years practicing law in Raleigh. Ray answered on the second ring, the way old soldiers always do, because a phone ringing after dark still means something to men like us. "Ray," I said, "I need your help, and I need you not to ask questions until I'm finished talking." There was a pause. Then Ray said, "Go ahead, Frank." So I told him. I told him about the letter from Harlan Doss, about the house on Cutter Ridge, about the cellar and the steel box and the leather journal and the 23 names and the phrase about California. I told him about the gold dust in the seams of the pages. I told him it took me 40 minutes, and Ray didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the line was quiet long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. "You still there?" "I'm here," Ray said. "I'm writing." He asked me to read him the names. All 23. I held the journal close to my face in the porch light and read them one at a time while Ray scratched each one down. When I finished, he asked me to spell the last 3 again, the ones with the Cherokee syllabary next to them. "Frank," he said, "don't touch anything else in that cellar. Don't take the journal off the property. Don't tell anyone, and I mean anyone, what's down there until I call you back. Can you do that?" I told him I could. "Give me 72 hours. He hung up without saying goodbye. That's how Ray ends every call. Has since 1969. I spent the next 3 days at the house. I slept in the truck the first night. Then on the second day, I drove into Lenoir and bought a cot, a Coleman lantern, a 50-pound bag of dog food, and a padlock for the cellar hatch. Boone didn't seem to mind the arrangement. He'd patrol the property in the mornings, nose low to the ground, circling the foundation like he was running perimeter. In the afternoons, he'd lie in the rectangle of sun that fell through the front window and sleep with his paws twitching. I didn't go back into the cellar. I'd given Ray my word. On the third afternoon, a Wednesday, I remember, because I could hear the garbage truck grinding up the switchback road below. My phone rang. Ray's voice was different, tighter. The voice of a man who has found something he wasn't prepared for. Frank, listen carefully. I ran the names through every database I have access to. Property records, mining claims, federal land grants, North Carolina Historical Registry. 7 of those 23 names appear on a consolidated mining claim filed in Burke County in 1849. The claim was never formally closed. It was abandoned after a series of deaths during the winter of 1851, and the rights reverted to the county, which never reassigned them because nobody ever came back to ask. He paused. Nobody came back, Frank, because the families were Cherokee. They were removed. The claim just sat there in a drawer for 170 years. I looked out at the ridge. The afternoon haze was gold and heavy. There's more, Ray said. The property you're sitting on, that house, that cellar, sits directly on top of the original claim boundary. Whoever built that house knew exactly what was underneath it. And Frank, the mineral rights were never separated from the surface deed. When Harlan Doss left you that property, he left you everything above and below. Boone lifted his head and looked at me. I swear that dog understood every word coming through the phone. But here's where it gets complicated, Ray continued. Because the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has a pending federal petition to recover exactly these kinds of abandoned claims. Their legal team filed it 18 months ago. It's working its way through the Bureau of Indian Affairs right now. If they find out about this property before we figure out what Harlan intended— I know what Harlan intended, I said. Ray went quiet on the other end. He intended for me to do the right thing. I said it before I'd even thought it through, but the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were true. Harlan Doss didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a decision, and he trusted me to make the one he couldn't make himself. Not because he was weak, but because by the time he understood what was underneath that house, he was 83 years old and living in a VA hospice in Waynesville with no family and no lawyer and no energy left to fight the fight that needed fighting. Ray started talking about assay values and legal timelines, and I let him talk. Boone had his chin on my knee, and I watched the afternoon light move across that cellar floor, where the mica and quartz still glittered in the beam of my flashlight. Somewhere beneath my boots was a vein of gold that had been sleeping since before the Trail of Tears. I thought about the men on that mountain in Ia Drang, who died holding ground that was given back to the enemy 6 months later. I thought about Harlan sitting in that cellar during the Depression, chipping at the rock, filling his pockets with dust that couldn't save his family. I thought about what it means to own something versus what it means to deserve it. Ray, I said, I want you to contact the Eastern Band's legal team. I want to meet with them." He paused. "You sure about that, Walt? We're talking about a claim that could be worth—" "I'm sure." It took 11 weeks. I drove to Cherokee, North Carolina, 3 times, sat in a conference room with 2 tribal attorneys and an elder named Samuel Rattler, who was 91 years old and remembered stories his grandmother told him about the gold veins in the plot balsams. I signed the mineral rights over to the Eastern Band on March 14th, 2024, in a ceremony that took 4 minutes and changed nothing about my daily life. I kept the house. They didn't want the house. I replaced the porch boards and patched the roof and put in a wood stove. Boone has a bed by the door where the morning sun hits. We drive down to Silva for groceries on Tuesdays. The tribal council sent me a letter 2 months later. They'd named the claim the Doss Barrow Seam, Harlan's name first, then mine. I put the letter in the kitchen drawer next to the deed. Some nights I sit on that porch and listen to the creek, and I think about what Harlan wrote in his letter, that he trusted me to understand. I think he meant that some things aren't yours just because your name is on the paper, and some debts don't belong to you personally, but you pay them anyway because someone has to. Boone knew before I did. That's the truth of it. He stood at that front door and refused to leave because he understood something I was too tired and too broke and too old to see, that the house wasn't the gift. The decision was. I'm Walt Barrow. I'm 74 years old. I served with the 1st Cavalry in a valley most Americans have never heard of, and I live in a house on a mountain with a dog who's smarter than me. If you've ever been handed something you didn't earn and had to figure out what the right thing was, you know. And if you served, and you came home, and you've been quiet about it ever since, I see you. Leave your story in the comments. I'd like to hear it.